Hello, everyone. I am going to start off with just a simple story here, and I'll give you a moment to think about it, and then I'll talk about why I'm starting with this story. So here's the story. A man and his son are in a terrible accident and are rushed to the hospital in critical care. The doctor looks at the boy and says, I can't operate on this boy. He's my son. How can this be? That's the question, right? It's like kind of like a riddle. I'm just going to give you just a few moments here to think about it, and then I'll talk about it. Okay, so it hasn't been very long, but some of you probably have actually heard the story before. It's pretty common. And the first way it was kind of brought up many years ago was to say that, well, a doctor doesn't mean a man, and that's how some people would have interpreted that. So it says a man and his son. That doesn't mean that the doctor, who is also a parent, clearly this is my son, that could be a woman. So that was one of the first ways this could have been interpreted. But then another interpretation came along a few years later where people brought this up again. They're like, well, how do we know it's not a gay couple? I mean, it could be two dads. So, yeah, a man and his son died. Then the doctor is just the other dad. It's two dads. So, point being, though, is that even when we try and think about our bias, right? The first example being, oh, well, it could have been a girl doctor. That's true. I mean, that is biased. But then even that has a bias within itself that actually could have been that's thinking still heteronormative, that could have been a homosexual relationship. So it's just interesting to see that development of like how tricky it can be when you hear something to try and divulge all the different biases that might have been involved with it and the preconceived notions. And so today is going to kind of dive into that idea of these preconceived notions and these biases that you might have when you hear something and when you see something before you actually maybe interact with it or get closer to it. So here's the objectives for the lesson today. Students will be able to discuss their own experiences with field and or pre-teaching programs, pre-service programs, whatever you want to call it, and how it relates to the articles or lesson. Really, and this is going to be about the specific article for this lesson. Students will be able to compare, contrast their own experiences with the described experiences within this article of these kinds of students or pre-teachers. And then students will be able to write a fictional narrative to emphasize the pros and or cons of field pre-teaching service programs. So I'll get into that a little bit more. That's a specific thing we're going to do today. The standards are there. Honestly, I wasn't quite sure what to put for standards because I'm teaching to you, my peers, at a college level. So I just brought some up from the senior, junior level of ELA. Talk about literacy and really, because we're going to do some reading and writing here, I figured that was the most appropriate standards to follow, especially with the activities that I have in mind. So just threw those in there if you want to look at those. My article, though, I haven't even brought up what it is, and here's the title: Are Teacher Education Programs Failing the Nation's Urban Schools? A closer look at pre-service teachers' beliefs about working with inner city students, specifically not just their beliefs, but their biases and their preconceived notions, right? And it was by two names that I'm not even going to attempt to say. It's on the screen, but that's just hard names to say, so I'm just going to leave them up there for you. Try to figure out on your own. They're both from Turkey, though. I remember that was in the introduction. So that was the article that this whole lesson is going to be based around. And here is a quote from that article. Student teachers presume urban students to be undermotivated with fewer academic skills, poor discipline, and little parental support in comparison with their suburban counterparts. That's a quote directly from this article. And it was specifically talking about a group of 38 to 41 pre-teaching, pre-service teachers, student teachers basically, who were involved with this study. And they had split them up in different ways, which I'll talk about more later. But this was just a general statement that kind of really emphasizes, I think, the entire point of this article, right, is to think about how are we looking at the students and the schools themselves and the culture, all that. And here you can kind of get the feeling undermotivated, fewer academic skills, poor discipline, little parental support, all negatives, right? Very, very strong impressions. And a lot of these pre-service teachers hadn't even worked in an urban school yet, right? So this is just their bias before they even interact with these types of schools. So that's important to note. Now, what I would do right now then for a class is this would be a good time to have a discussion just to get some of those ideas out there before we dive into any of the details within the article. Let's think about our own experiences. So here's the discussion questions I would have. What are some biases or were some biases that you'd heard or even had yourself when you were a field student or a student teaching or pre-service teaching program, whatever pathway you had taken, and were these biases addressed in your undergraduate education courses? Or even your experiences, perhaps, would be another way of thinking about it, not just the courses. And then other things to think about within that are, where did you pre-teach at? What was the environment and demographics like? So where did you end up being placed, right, when you were in like field or student teaching? Do you think that affected your view on the different schools or different types of schools, and why or why not? That would be a discussion that could be had right now, since of course that isn't happening and I am alone here recording this. I will kind of think of some things myself of what I would include in this discussion as someone who had done these things myself. So bias that I had heard, very similar to that quote that had just been read, right? It's like it's they're tougher kids is how people like, they try and cover it with soft language, like tougher kids, a big one is the parental involvement. And, I think that within bias, we should separate that there is sometimes truth within some of those things. So I think if we looked at the stats, you would find parental involvement in urban schools is going to be less. That is not wrong. But still, if you go in without even interacting, you don't even know the specific school you're going to be working with. If you already have that bias, right, you have to consider how that's going to affect how you're going to interact with them, what your expectations are, right? We've talked about that a lot. Expectations of students is important. So that's something still that's important. You can still have truths within some of these biases, but it doesn't mean that it isn't negative affecting your relationships or how you're going to handle yourself when you're involved with these kinds of things. Or if you're willing to involve yourself with these things, maybe you're not. That's something we'll talk about as well. So for me, I went to a school that was an urban school for pre-teaching. So my involvement when this would be like, oh yeah, I heard a lot of these biases, and then I got involved, and then I had a good time. I had a really good cooperating teacher. A lot of the kids, they were difficult, but it wasn't any different than my own experiences as a kid or my peers in high school. Like some of them would just not work, right? We were unmotivated. It didn't seem any different to me, even though I grew up in smaller schools, small towns, right? But kids are still kids to me. And so that would have been my personal experience, my personal thoughts on it. Had I had some bias going into it? Yes, but having that experience and being in a placement that had allowed me to interact with a bigger school with a wider range of diversity, it did affect me, right? For this last question, did it affect my view on those schools? It definitely did, right? I realized that despite some of the negative outlook I'd had, I didn't change the experience I had while student teaching. I still had a good experience. And why or why not? It's just because those things that you might think about before you get there don't actually have nearly as big of an impact on your experience as you might think they do, or not even as prevalent as maybe you thought they would be, or things like that. So that's why or why not for me. So that's what I would have involved myself with this discussion. That's what I would have brought to the table. But there would be other people, I'm sure, who would have completely different viewpoints. I went to a school where, for undergraduate at UW La Crosse, and there were some people who had admitted that they had never really met certain diverse groups ever. That they had come from small white schools. They got to that school, UW La Crosse, predominantly white still. And so their first interactions were in some of these classes, education classes, or any of their core classes. And then first time they met someone who's black, first time they met someone who's Hispanic, like whatever it might be, that was their first interaction. And so you can already kind of think about some of these preconceived notions that they might have had, which is kind of biased too in itself by saying that, but it's also has an element of truth again to it, where it's like, well, if they've never interacted with these people, what is their impression going to be based on? It's going to be purely based on word of mouth of other people, social media itself, coverage like news, all the stats you might hear about for different groups. All that's going to affect how they think about it, because they've never actually met these people, these different kinds of people. They've never met them. So That's another viewpoint. There could also be someone who is colored themselves, who had grown up in an urban school. That'd still be different than my experience, right? So the whole point of this discussion would be to bring all those viewpoints together and hear about them, which we've all done. I'm sure this is a graduate class. So, I mean, this discussion would only emphasize that point further. It'd be a great discussion. But I think you can see the point of where this discussion would be valuable. Like, why would we do it? Now, I'm going to bring up a couple subjects and their quotes about what they had thought about going into these schools, what they thought about these schools, kinds of schools, environments, from the article. So this is directly from the article. So the study they are referring to, they had many subjects. Like I said, I think up to 41. These are certain subjects. This is subject 38, and down here will be subject 30. And this is what they said. I've never experienced urban schools directly, but my expectations or thoughts of the physical appearance is that it has bars on the window, graffiti on the walls, students gathered in big groups outside, talking and smoking. Inside the halls are loud, crowded, and vandalized. So again, what is the impression that they have? Well, they've never, for one, experienced it. So this is all a preconceived notion. Never been experienced in urban school. Meaning they didn't grow up in one. And up to this point, if they had any field experience, it wasn't with these kinds of schools. But they still have expectations and thoughts. So what do they think of? Well, almost like a prison. It sounds like bars on the window. You think of like a ghetto with graffiti on the walls. You think about like degenerate activities, or however you want to word it. It's not a positive activity to be smoking, right? It's loud, crowded, vandalized. That's kind of like a criminal word almost, right? To think about it, that's a act of crime to vandalize something. So if you break it down with some of the words they're using, you can already see what they have as their preconceived notion, right? That's just one. Let's go look at the next one. Subject 30. Coming from a suburban community on Long Island, I find myself a bit apprehensive about entering an urban school. All you hear about is violence, metal detectors, gangs, security personnel of the urban school. Coming from a learning environment where we did not have an actual security guard until my senior year of high school, I am worried about what to expect. So, before I jump on any further, I mean, again, what are we thinking? What is the picture being drawn for these pre-service teachers? That's what these are. These are people who are going to be future educators. And this is what they're thinking. And this isn't, again, to try and look down upon these kinds of people. It's more to address the problems that come from these ideas, right? And a big one is that they have a negative impersonation, or impression, not impersonation. And they're apprehensive about it. They're scared in a way. And a lot of it comes from, well, bars on the window up here, and then you hear metal detectors and gangs down here with security personnel, security officers. We have some of those here in the local area, KUSD, right? I sub in the area right now, and I've been to the different schools, and I don't know about metal detectors, but they definitely have security in the different high schools. So, I mean, you think about that, it's like, for someone who's never experienced it, right, that they talk about that. They never had one till their senior year of high school themselves. I mean, that's pretty concerning. I would understandably concerning, because then you're like, well, what's going on here that requires this? Like, that means that there's a higher rate of violent acts, you would think, or theft or something not good. And so, again, this isn't necessarily to highlight that they're wrong, right? It's because there could be factual honesty in some of these concerns that they have. But it doesn't mean that it's not going to negatively impact how they interact with these people, right? So it's still separating that. There might be truth here, but there's still bias, and there's still negative effects that can come from having these preconceived notions. And so some reflective questions I would pose at this point would be, can you relate to their perspectives? Because that's the first thing here. It's not to say that these people are just ignorant and they have no valuable insight or perspective. They have these perspectives for a reason, like I've talked about. And so try and relate that to yourself. What are some similarities, but also differences from yourself and these perspectives that we just heard about? I mean, for one, I'm not from Long Island, so I mean, I don't know what it's like. So, I mean, that's a completely different area of our country. So, I mean, maybe it's different over there too. So we have to understand that too, right? That there are already going to be some differences perhaps in the way they perceive things simply based on geographical location and culture and all that stuff. So, I mean, that's one thing, but I can still relate to their perspective. Like, have I had some of these similar thoughts? Have I had some lower expectations of what the school will look like when I get there? Did I expect the schools to be as nice as they are? Even in KUSD, I'll be honest, no. Didn't expect them to be very nice looking, even though they are. Like, Bradford's actually pretty nice. I did not expect that going into it. Just being 100% straightforward about it, right? So, I mean, it's understandable to have these perspectives and to have some of these biased views. Now, the real important question here then is, how can we try and counter those concerns? Because, again, like I said, there's some reality to some of these concerns. So it's not as if they're wrong for thinking this, but you also have to try and balance it out. A bit like, okay, well, you might have some valid concerns here, but is it worth having those concerns? Like, is it as bad as you think it's going to be? Or maybe it's going to be better than you think, like in a very positive way. And so how can we try and find those positive aspects to try and make sure that these negative ones aren't going to seep in, right? And a big thing I'm going to talk about, and maybe this is a bit of a spoiler for later, but a big reason why this is important is that this is stopping student teachers who become future educators to go and work in these schools. And so we think about numbers all the time. We think about test numbers, all that stuff. But in reality, a big number that's important is how many teachers are willing to work at these schools. If this is not their first choice, if they don't have a passion for working in these schools, either they're not going to work there, or they will because all their options, their first options, aren't there. So they're forced to work in schools that they have no real love for or passion for. And that's not great. I mean, we know how it is with therapy. If you force someone into therapy, it doesn't typically work. So you can't force people into something, which is another topic I'll come back to in a little bit, actually, near the end of this lesson. But then how do we change that perspective? How do we try and counter some of these concerns? And some of those concerns would be, well, maybe you just show them pictures. You know, maybe that's a counter. Bars on the window. Show them that there's no bars on the window. I mean, it could be pretty straightforward stuff like that. You don't have to always like try and get super political about anything. You don't have to get super in-depth about statistics even. Sometimes just seeing it, even pictures, or going to the schools themselves, that's all it takes to try and get rid of a lot of these biases. Because they've never been. That's the huge part about it. They've never been there. They've never interacted with these schools or the students within or the teachers within. So, I mean, that's a huge way, in my opinion, that we could counter a lot of these concerns. It's just to have them have the experience, right? Hear from people who have had the experience. Well, what was it actually like when you went there? I mean, be real about it. If they had a bad experience, then don't hide that. But also, I'm sure there's plenty of positive experiences with these things. So bring those out. Make sure that that is something that they hear about, they interact with. And really, I do think the best way is get them involved. Get them to see pictures at the very least, if not go in person to some of these schools, some of these districts. The last question is probably one of the deeper ones that I have for this reflective piece here is, what effect do you think these preconceptions about the schools and their students have on these future teachers? Well, I've already kind of alluded to a little bit of that. They won't want to teach at these kinds of schools. And if they do, it's more like they're forced to because they couldn't find a job somewhere else. So already, though, we know what happens when someone walks into somewhere with low expectations, low standards of what they are going to do. You don't want someone sitting there trying to collect paychecks, for example. That's not what teaching's about. For one, you don't get paid that much anyway. But also, you know, if you're not passionate about it, what are you doing? There's other things you could be doing, right? So you want people who will like being in these places, who will respect the culture and have a very deep love and interest and passion for these kinds of places that maybe have been undervalued. And so I think that's a huge effect it could have on it. Whether positive or negative, it's obviously going to affect the direction of how they're going to interact, if they're even going to go there in the first place. So is it really that impactful, though? You might be wondering. Is it really that important to have positive preconceptions, we'll say? Well, here's one thing from the article again. I'm not trying to pull too many things from the article because I know that's just a lot. So I'm just trying to highlight the big parts here. And here's one. Marx and And Rudney in 1999 conducted a related investigation to these things, exploring how a 1 week field placement in Chicago, so very close to us, urban settings, influenced teachers' attitudes towards students of different backgrounds and their beliefs about urban school teaching. They observed 25 participants' field experiences and examined these students' self-reports. So again, it is on self-reports, so you have to understand that can have its own jar of worms in it. Still, in addition, they reviewed the reflective essays written by students from the Human Resource Competence document, one of the requirements for teaching licensure there, apparently. The findings of the study revealed that field experiences played a significant role in helping pre-service teachers to develop positive attitudes towards students of different cultural backgrounds and learn how to address diversity effectively in their classrooms. So again, this isn't even like, again, it is a problem, like I mentioned, of like they won't even want to teach at these schools. But even if they don't, if they're going to teach in another school, it'll still have diversity. It's going to affect how they learn to address diversity effectively in their classroom, according to this article. And their positive attitudes towards students with different cultural backgrounds is going to be affected. Are they going to have those positive attitudes? I mean, you're going to need them. So, I mean, having that experience, this is just a 1 week field placement too. Just 1 week. That's all it took to have a significant impact. So it is very impactful, the preconceived notions, but also the programs, which is what we're addressing too. That's the overarching question here. Is it a problem how these programs go through and teach future educators and how they, what experience they give them? Is that impactful? Clearly, according to this, it is. So this is an activity I would do. I'm just going to talk about it. We're not actually going to go through it. I'm not even going to make an example. But I thought this would be a cool thing to do if I was actually teaching this in like person or something. And what they would include. So I don't want, at this point, us all to write a story, just a short story. It doesn't have to be long, like a page, about a pre-service teacher. And the whole point is to try and think about all the things we've talked about. How do they affect our preconceived notions? Well, what could they be, for one? And how do our backgrounds affect what those are? The story could be positive or negative. So what are the positive aspects of it? Or what are some of the negative aspects that we've talked about that can come through? And so what I would like to include in these stories would be their background. So what schools had they gone through? What is their upbringing like? Right? What experiences do they have with these different kinds of categories with schools? Is it going to be a positive or negative story? You'd want to think about that from the get-go. What experience are they going to have, this made-up pre-service teacher? And what are you trying to showcase, really? What's the point of your story? Are you going to show that they change over time from their field placement of how, like, maybe someone never interacted and then they had these biases and then they interact with like that 1 week in Chicago that was just mentioned, and now they've changed for the better? Or are you going to showcase the ignorance and how it is negative? So maybe they never had experience, and then you talk about when they get into their first classroom, they have like a really poor attitude towards certain certain students with diverse backgrounds. I mean, it could be any of those things. So this would be a really cool creative exercise, I think. And then the last thing would be like inner thoughts. What are they thinking? What is this character like? Try and justify some of their actions, right, with their thought process. And then that's within their peers. So when they're interacting with other teachers, if you wanted to include that in the story, the students, or even in their courses, maybe they're not graduated yet. Maybe they're doing student teaching. All right. So this could be about pre-service, but it could also be like a flashback, and then you talk about what they're like as an actual teacher too. The whole point of the story, though, would just be to try and think about all the different ways that we could all come up with stories that would really highlight how this experience is important and how that can be positive or negative and really change the course of how a teacher is going to be when they teach. To try and finish off this, I'm going to show a short video and then go to my exit ticket. So here's the video.
Not right away. I was up in San Francisco a while ago doing a book signing. There was this guy buying a book. He was in his 30s, and I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm a fireman." And I said, "How long have you been a fireman?" He said, "Always. I've always been a fireman." And I said, "Well, when did you decide?" He said, "As a kid." He said, "Actually, it was a problem for me at school, because at school, everybody wanted to be a fireman." He said, "But I wanted to be a fireman, you know." And he said, "When I got to the senior year of school, my teachers didn't take it seriously. This one teacher didn't take it seriously. He said, I was throwing my life away if that's all I chose to do with it." that I should go to college, I should become a professional person, I had great potential, and I was wasting my talent to do that. And he said it was humiliating because he said it in front of the whole class, and I really felt dreadful. But it's what I wanted. And as soon as I left school, I applied to the fire service, and I was accepted. And he said, you know, I was thinking about that guy recently, just a few minutes ago when you were speaking about this teacher. He said, because 6 months ago, I saved his life. He said he was in a car wreck, and I pulled him out, gave him CPR, and I saved his wife's life as well. He said, I think he thinks better of me now. Yeah. You know what I mean? Human communities depend upon a diversity of talent, not a singular conception of ability. And at the heart of our challenges, at the heart of the challenge is to reconstitute our sense of ability and of intelligence. This linearity thing is...
That's about it for that video. But the point being, right, that short story, so if we're going back to the assignment I would have had for writing a story, it doesn't have to be long. And that was a very short story, but it already showed a lot. I mean, it showed a teacher who had a preconception about, it didn't even have anything to do necessarily even like race, gender, or anything like that, just going to college or not. I mean, it's a very common thing, though. We hear about it all the time. And they undervalue a job, and so they're embarrassing a student, for one. That's not great, right? Saying that in front of everyone and looking down on someone because they want to be a firefighter, right? I mean, it just goes to show a short story like that, though, can really highlight how impactful that can be. And in this case, obviously, the student didn't care and went on and did their dream and saved their life later, which is crazy. But I mean, that easily could have impacted that kid to change their future, and then they wouldn't have been there to save them, for one. And I mean, it just goes to show how powerful it can be, the influence, and also the interaction. You saw how negative it was. So that teacher's biases had already come to affect that relationship they could have had with that student too. So it's just so important. And when we're talking about preconceived notions, I showed that video as well because it is more than just the specific things within urban schools that we're talking about. That's the focus, of course, for this class, but just in general, to take a step back and to be macro more about it, is that this is a skill in general that we should always be considering as a teacher, right? Is that any of these preconceived notions about possible future jobs that a student talks about wanting to be a rapper or something. You hear many rappers talk about that, how their teachers all laughed at them in high school. And you understand why. Again, like, there's some truth to it. Like, are you going to be the one in a million who gets that opportunity and makes it successful? Maybe it's out of concern that they say, but it's about the positivity that we should be bringing, right? And encouraging students and trying to not view certain pathways or schools or anything in a negative way. Always check yourself, right? Check your bias. The exit ticket then at the end of all this, and this would help me if I read all these, right? This would be my own reflection, but your reflection would help me reflect. It'd be, what would you change about pre-service teaching programs to help with the preconceived notions? And at the end of the article, they had in their conclusion, the big thing that they wanted, so this kind of hint of maybe what you could bring to the table, how you bring it would be the real answer to this question, but more interaction with diversity. We saw the 1 week in Chicago with that quote, right, from the article, huge difference in how the pre-service teachers would have been looking at urban schools. Just 1 week. So how do we get more interaction with diversity? And that would be the exit ticket. So thank you for your time.